Shalom, welcome again. This is Shamir, and today we're going to look at a couple of words. And what we want to do is to understand how we get the meaning of what's being said and how these words connect not only from the Tanakh but also into the New Testament or the apostolic writings. Because most of the apostolic writings are coming from the Tanakh. 99.9% of it is coming from there, and almost everything Yeshua says is coming from the Tanakh. He's either directly quoting or paraphrasing or alluding to the Tanakh in what he says, and we really need to see it as more of one book instead of two separate testaments as well. So, with no further ado, let's get started in our short little lesson now. Anose ha-tat, the one bearing sin. So here on this slide we have two verses. One's from John 1:29 and the other one from Leviticus 16:20. And what we want to see is how these two verses connect to each other. So the first one, Hine say, behold, the sheep or goat. Say is a sheep or goat. Ha-Elohim, Ha-Elohim, or of God. And then Ha-Nosei, the one bearing Chatat, the sins, Ha-Olam, of the world. And then our second one, Leviticus 16:22, Venasa ha-Sa'ir, the goat shall bear alav, on itself, et kol avonotam. And we do notice that there are two different words here being used for sin or transgressions. In John 1:29 we have chatat for sins, and then in Leviticus 16:22 we have avonotam, iniquities. There's also peshaim. I would say that the best translation for pesha is crime. Because it is a crime to break the Torah, to break God's commandments is a crime. Since the Torah is a legal binding document in blood, when you break it, then you are committing a crime. You're like a criminal. Now between these two verses we see similarities. Yeshua being described as the say, and then the sheep or the goat, and then in Leviticus we see ha-Sa'ir, the goat, the scapegoat. So in this part we see that Yeshua is similar to this scapegoat that we see in Leviticus 16. The sins of Israel were cast upon the scapegoat, and the scapegoat Nasa bore the sins and was taken away from the camp. And so we see the same meaning in John 1:22. We see Yeshua as the scapegoat who bears the sins of the world. Leviticus 19:8, we see avonoto, his sin yisa, his sin he will bear. And this is the idea that the one who breaks God's commandments willingly bears his own guilt. But then we see with Yeshua that he's not bearing his own guilt. He's not bearing avono, his sin, but he's bearing our sin. And then in Isaiah 53:12, we have our prophetic idea here, Vehu chet rabim nasa, and he bore the sin of many. And so this is actually also a parallel to John 1:29 that we find in Isaiah, and we have the same language of nasa and chet. So here in Isaiah 53, chet is another version of chatat. Vehu chet rabim, and the sins of many, nasa, he bore. And so we see this word again. It is spelled a little bit different in the modern New Testament because they are using present tense. In the Hebrew, there is no present tense, so we just have past and future. And just to correct myself, when I said there's no future tense, I meant in biblical Hebrew there's no future tense. It's generally past or future tense, and then there's a bunch of grammatical things that happen that make things possible. So, and then lastly, in 1 Peter 2:24, we see again a repeat of what we've already seen both in the Tanakh and in the Apostolic writings. Asher et chataenu nasa begufo. Our sin chataenu nasa, he bore begufo, on his body. So then we get the idea or picture again of the scapegoat, the one that receives all of the punishment and guilt and crimes of Israel and carries them off. And so Yeshua also is doing this, bearing all the sins, all the crimes, transgressions of humanity on his body, begufo. And as a disclaimer, and as always, there's way more to say, but of course, due to the brevity of the video, I can't do that. But I will say this, and this will come up in the next video, is that when we change words in the English, and trust me, that is done in your translations, you not only lose the meaning of what's being said, but you also lose the ability to be able to connect texts together. For example, if you put the word cross in every verse, it's not always correct and should not always be there because it's not the word that's being used. And when you do use it, you disconnect the apostolic writings or New Testament from the Tanakh and from the meaning of what's being said. We also see this with the word church being inserted into English Bibles, but that is not correct for many reasons. It's just not what it says. It's not the word that's being used, and then because it's changed, it gives a different meaning to the book, and so that's problematic. I'm not saying these things to offend anyone, but it's just a reality. It's just a reality that we have to deal with translations. No translation is pure because most translators have some kind of agenda or bias, or use different manuscripts. Like the NIV uses a more corrupt manuscript, and that manuscript is also used for the modern New Testament, so it cannot count on it 100%. So I do use the Greek text because it's necessary, and then you have instances also where the the Hebrew New Testament is correct and the Greek might not be correct. It didn't pick up on a Hebraism or the connection to the Tanakh it should have, and then vice versa. So even within that, you have to be careful on what you're doing. Someone is blowing the shofar at this exact moment, actually, because we are getting ready for Yom Teruah, which we say Rosh Hashanah, but it's really Yom Teruah, and that's, of course, a whole nother story. So that is it, everyone. I will leave you. I wish you Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful Shabbat, a restful Shabbat in your Mashiach, and be blessed. In Yeshua's name, Amen.